In this section, we're going to create this beautiful layout with very simple techniques without writing a single line of code. We're going to cover the main elements such as text, images, and icons that are built in. And then we're going to learn about stacks and colors as well as material. Now, this is going to adapt really well to light mode and dark mode as well as different size. Back to Xcode, we have the main content view. This is where we're going to compose the layout, and we have the preview on the right side. Now, by default, this is completely interactive, but you can also switch to selectable, which allows you to select different elements. And as you can see, everything that you see here, there's an equivalent of that in code. So you don't need to write anything at the moment. Just use it as if it was a design tool, except that your code dictates the visuals and the functions, which makes this infinitely powerful and allows you to build real fully functional apps. Notice that we have two elements. We have the icon and the text, and then we have the dot properties, and these are called modifiers. The same way that we have the properties in Figma. For a rectangle, you can set the colors, the positioning, and all that stuff. Well, it's very similar here. And in fact, all those properties exist in the inspector as well. So you can see here in the attributes inspector, you have the content, the style, and the sizes. For example, I can change the existing properties such as image scale from large to medium. And notice that it's updating in the code as well. Then I can select the elements from the preview, or I can also select it from the code. So this will do the same thing. In fact, it's a lot more efficient to do that from the code itself. And we can change the content in the property just like this. For the text, I'm going to choose a different font. And this list here is the dynamic type list, which means that these are preset sizes such as subheadline. And when I do that, it's going to add a new modifier. So if you don't know about dynamic type, go to developer and find the design tab, where you're going to scroll down a little bit to find the human interface guidelines. Now here, you're going to go to foundation and select typography. If you scroll down a little bit, you're going to find a guide for dynamic type. So we're going to go here for specification iOS, iPadOS dynamic type sizes. You're going to find that we have a list of preset sizes. And it's really important to use dynamic type because it's going to adapt automatically to different accessibility sizes set by the user, which makes this a lot more accessible and also easier to manage. So these are the default sizes, and it's very important to know them by heart because they are the standard. So for example, the large title is 34 and the body is 17. And you have a little bit of variation depending on how much space that you have or how important the text is. And so for the titles, you have 1 to 3. For the body, you have the headline. And then for the smaller text, you have the subheadline as well as the caption and footnote. Now for the symbols, we're going to use SF Symbols 5. And this is a set of 5,000 icons that you can use for your project. It's made by Apple, and this year it comes with animation, which we're going to learn later. Now there's an app that you should download, and it looks like this. So you have all of the icons. You can change the different sizes in terms of the line width, and you can also change the colors, the rendering mode. So it's really comprehensive. As I mentioned before, you don't have to export anything from Figma to use these. They are built in, and all you need to do is to use the name of the icon. So let's search for sparkles, and here we're going to use this one. So you can just right click and copy the name, go back to Xcode, And here you can change directly in the code or in the inspector. It's definitely a lot more responsive to do that in the code. So copy and paste right there. It's definitely a good thing to get used to editing in the code, especially for the content. So between quotes and for the modifiers, you can just change by typing the property. So we're putting it back to large from the code, and you can see that it's changing. And we have the beautiful auto completion as well, which has massively improved in Xcode 15. So it's a lot more contextual. It's going to give you the appropriate options for the right element. Cool. So now let's try to insert a new element. So you have the plus sign right here, and this is going to show the insert menu. So we have the tab starting with the media. So these are the images that you have imported. You also have the colors that you have created, as well as the SF symbols. So here we're going to look at the views. So those are the elements such as image and text. And then you have the modifiers. So these are the properties applied to the elements. So in this case, we're going to search for text, and then you can just drag and drop to your code, and it's going to make the place for you depending on where you want to place it. So in this case, I'm going to place it right after the text. Now in coding, it's very important to place things correctly and to have the right keywords. And so in this case, you need to place the text inside the stack, and you have to have a single container. Just think of it as a frame in Figma. So you wouldn't be able to place this text outside of that stack. Otherwise, it's going to simply give you an error. Likewise, for modifiers, you wouldn't be able to use some modifiers on some elements. So image scale would only work on image, and it wouldn't work on text. Now the blue text here means that it's a placeholder. So you can double click on it to be able to edit it, and we're going to change that to size. Then let's add some properties. We're going to change this to subheadline, and the weight should be semi-bold. Now let's talk about stacks, because we have one stack which is a V stack, and this is for a vertical stack, spreading elements inside it consistently. So we have the same spacing between elements, and you can also change the padding, for example, as well as the alignment. So there's definitely a default which is centered. And also notice that all of the elements take the minimum size. So this is different from CSS, which tends to take the maximum space. So here I can change the alignment to left. Notice that it says leading, and that means left, but also that depends on the country. Sometimes that can be reversed. So you have leading and trailing. Now I'm going to put it back to center, and I want to create a new container for the text. So here, if you want to embed an element inside a new container, again, we're not going to write anything. So we can right click on the text, and here we have a bunch of really cool options, such as embedding in a new stack. So I'm going to embed in VStack, and now I have a different container that can have its own spacing and alignment. But first, let me add another text. So the shortcut for adding is Shift, Command, and L to make it faster. So let's search for text and drag and drop that right after the first text. Now again, we have a placeholder. We're going to set to 1024 by 1024. And now I want to be able to apply the same properties as the first text to the second text. But here's the thing. We can, of course, just apply the same properties here, but it's redundant. And the goal of coding is to be efficient. So we want to write as little code as possible. So one cool thing that you can do, and we're going to take it up a notch, which is to simply cut these properties, instead of applying just to the first text, Command X from the modifiers to the end of the text and apply those properties to the stack instead. And this is going to apply those styles to both elements. So indentation is really important in SwiftUI. In fact, this is what allows us to determine if it's a property or if it's an element, and it's making it a lot easier to read. So one thing you can do is to use the tab to set these indentation, but otherwise you can also set the entire code by selecting it and do Control-I to do automatic indentation for you. Great. Now that we have a separate stack, we can select the keyword and then set the alignment to leading. Then I want to change the color of my first text to have a different color. So here we have the preset iOS colors and also the custom color sets that I created. But notice that it doesn't have the secondary colors. So those are dynamic colors that automatically adapt to light and dark mode. And this is where we start to see the limitations of the visual editor. So for example, I can set to black, and from here I can use the auto completion instead. So I can set color dot and then secondary. Now, if you want to learn more about the colors in iOS, which has the system colors for light mode and dark mode, you also have these preset colors such as primary, secondary, and tertiary, which has also light mode and dark mode. By default, if you don't set anything, it's simply going to use primary. So now we're going to set 3 columns. And here we're going to right click on the VStack and click on embed in HStack. Let me fix the indentation, and I'm going to duplicate the VStack here. So from the end of the font weight modifier, I'm going to shift until the beginning of the curly brace and then do Command D twice. So now we have 2 more columns with the same content. To make it more readable, we can press Enter between those stacks. Again, we're getting used to coding. Eventually, you're going to be able to read this much quicker. I'm also maximizing my space right here. And let's change the content for the second one to type and then upscale. Then date, today 5/19. Now I'm going to insert a divider line between those columns. So let's go to the insert and search for divider. And I'm going to drag and drop right before the VStack, so between those VStacks, and I'm gonna do that another time like this. Let's add some lines to make it easier. And now we have the entire HStack from here to here. You can tell by clicking on the curly braces. So you can see from where it begins and where it ends. And this is really important in coding because everything that you open has to be closed eventually, including parentheses and curly braces. Now, one thing we're noticing is that the divider seems to be pushing the content. And this is really important to understand in SwiftUI is that most elements such as text, images will take the minimum size, but some elements such as colors and dividers will take the maximum size. And so when that happens, you want to go to the HStack and we're going to set the frame to have a maximum height of 44. Then I will also set the spacing to be 12 between elements. So now let's talk about custom modifiers, because here we have a limited amount of properties that you can use, but there are hundreds of them that are possible in code. So we're going to select the VStack, and here you can see that it doesn't have a background modifier, but we need that. So let's go to the modifier input, and we're going to search for background. And it's going to add a custom one here, and then I'll scroll down a little bit to find the property Again, this is using a placeholder, and you don't want to have that in your code. So double click on it, and you don't want to leave it empty. So set dot green. Notice that I'm not specifying the color, such as here. And that's because Swift is type inferred, meaning that if it knows that it's a color, then you don't need to specify it, which makes the code a lot more concise. So if you want, you can just delete the color from these properties. So going back to the background modifier, here another thing we can do in the inspector is to set a gradient for the green. So I can just do dot gradient and voila. Next, let's add a new modifier called corner radius, because designers love corner radius, and we're gonna set this to 20. Then I'll set the padding to 20, because by default, if you don't set anything, it's going to set to 16 for padding. And again, that depends on the elements. Some, like the stack, will have different default values. So here I'm going to double click to make sure that we don't have a placeholder value. And one final thing to keep in mind is that the order of the modifiers is very important. So for example, if you set the corner radius before the gradient, you're going to see that there's no corner radius. And that's because each modifier is like a container. So the code is read from top to bottom. And if you don't have a gradient yet, the corner radius is just applying it, nothing visual. So I'm going to put it back. After the background, it's going to show the corner radius. Likewise, you can have multiple paddings. So for example, I can copy and paste a second padding, and I can customize also if I want it just at the top or at the bottom. So it's going to customize the code for me. And also, just to show you that how each of these modifiers is essentially a container, I can just have multiple backgrounds. So copy and paste the different paddings and background modifiers. And you're going to see that if I change this to blue, then you're going to have the containers, which is blue first, and then you're going to have the one that is green. So if I set another corner radius here, you're going to see that it's applying to the blue gradient. So very important to understand the order of the modifiers, and keep in mind that you can have multiple of the same modifiers. And that makes it super efficient because, for example, in CSS, you would have to create many containers to achieve those different backgrounds. So from here, what I can suggest, if you're new to SwiftUI, is to really play with the inspector, with the insert menu, and look at all of the different views that you can use and the different modifiers that you can use, and look at the code sample to really understand all the possible things. Because from here, we're going to do everything in code because it's a lot more efficient, and we're no longer limited by the options that are available in the inspector. In the next section, we're going to do the rest of the layout. So we're going to take a look at the material sheet and light mode and dark mode and the different preview options. So I'll see you in the next section.